Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I am AIN Alerts editor Chad Trautvetter. In this week's episode, senior editor Curt Epstein discusses what NBAA-BACE, the U.S. business aviation show slated for October 6 to 8 in Orlando, would look like if it is indeed held. I'll share highlights of traffic data that shows a promising recovery for business aviation. Washington, D.C. editor Kerry Lynch talks about a new FAA proposal for pilot record keeping that has caught the ire of corporate flight departments. Editor-in-chief Matt Thurber gives an overview of accident reports of the May Pakistan International Airlines A320 crash, and separately, a September 2018 crash of a Falcon 50. And senior editor Charles Alcock compares the different ways Lufthansa and Qantas are trying to emerge intact from the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so it's about T-minus 100 days to the to NBAA-BACE, which is the U.S. business aviation show in Orlando. And Curt, what are you hearing about that?
Well, Chad, we're approaching, as you mentioned, that magical 90 days out between now and the start of the show, which should be on October 6th. And for the exhibitors, that's a big deal because there's a lot of logistics planning that needs to take place between now and then. You've got very large booths, in some case 2-story booths that have to be arranged. You need to have hotel rooms set up, travel arrangements set, and companies are looking for a little more clarity in what to expect and if the show is actually going to go on. And I think we may actually get some clarity on this in the next week or so. NBA has indicated that there's going to be some information coming around July 4th. So that could possibly be the go, no-go we've been waiting to hear. And with Florida being one of the hot spots currently in the United States for COVID transmission, it's really a thought that's on a lot of people's minds.
So what would the show look like? And compare that to the S&D show that you were at in March, right before the COVID crisis hit.
Well, it's NBA has indicated from the information we've received that mask wearing could be mandatory, and aisles could be marked one way, so to minimize face-to-face interaction. It's looking as if it will be a smaller show if it takes place. NBA has said that they have about 540 exhibitors signed up right now, including some of the major companies such as Gulfstream, Embraer, Bombardier. Textron has said that it will not be attending. It said it will not be attending any trade shows for the rest of the year, but there are still a good, as I mentioned, 540 companies that have signed on. Now, there's typically 1,000 exhibitors at NBAA, so the show would be smaller in scale. NBA is telling companies that they're about 90% booked up, so it shows that they are planning for a smaller show footprint. As far as things like the static display go, the static, obviously one of the more popular parts of the annual gathering, typically attracts about 100 aircraft, but how exhibitors will be dealing with that this year remains to be seen as well if this goes on, because if they're showing aircraft, will they be wanting to clean them after every party has gone on board? Will they just limit the onboard activities to really qualified buyers? Will you need to basically register in advance to see the aircraft rather than just wander on board? These are all things that exhibitors and showgoers will have to be contemplating as the show gets closer.
So what happened at S&D in March? It was right on the cusp of COVID-19, and the show was actually cut short because of it. And what did it look like at S&D?
It was indeed. And as you mentioned, the show was supposed to go from Tuesday through Friday. And on Thursday, they informed everyone that there would be no programming on Friday, and the show would indeed end at the end of the day on Thursday. And people basically got out of there in Charlotte as soon as they could make their reservations. So what it's looking like, as I said, I was there in Charlotte, and it didn't seem to be much in the way of precautions going on. This was in early to mid-March, and is before the virus had really taken hold in the United States. There were hand sanitizer stations around at various desks. There were no masks being worn, and there were no one-way aisles, certainly. There were some major exhibitors who had decided at the last minute that they were not going to attend. In some cases, booths were constructed, but not attended, not staffed. Other companies, their booths and equipment were just left where they were delivered on the show floor until their crates were taken away. So the one major thing I saw was not by NBAA, but by the Charlotte Convention Center, where on the door in and out of the restrooms, they had placed a fixture at the bottom of the door where you could operate it by your toe without having to touch the door at all, the door handle. So as far as what's going to be done, NBAA says it's consulted with local and federal health officials and with the Orange County Convention Center executives who are following all the recommended advice. So as far as what it will look like, it remains to be seen.
That's interesting, Curt. And Chad, what that brings to mind for me is what sort of condition is the business aviation sector in as it starts to ponder the next big show? What have you heard?
Well, actually, it's getting better, a lot better than the airlines, certainly. Over the past few weeks, we've been getting data that looks actually kind of promising. In this past week, we got data from FlightAware, and they said that actually on Saturday, June 20th, business aviation traffic was actually up 2.5% from last year. Now, that doesn't mean it's all recovered, but that's a good sign. It's a good data point that things can get better. But Argus is saying that they're expecting traffic to get about 83% of normal in June and at the end of June into July and August, and then after that they expect the traffic to kind of track with what Wall Street sees. So that's an unknown right now because Wall Street right now is taking this in stride. But as the COVID crisis kind of drags on a bit, that may take a toll on the stock market as well, and that might have implications for business aviation. They're not in Argus is certainly not seeing any kind of a full recovery until at least October, and they're saying probably more like 12 to 18 months is more likely.
Interesting.
So there's some concern on the FAA front with pilot records, and we heard more about it from NBAA this week. What's going on, Kerry, with this?
Well, NBAA has actually issued a call to its members to weigh in on a notice of proposed rulemaking that was issued in March. And that deadline's coming up at the end of June 29, which is why we're hearing about it for NBAA. They're gravely concerned about this proposal because it's expanding dramatically the number of entities that would be captured within pilot record keeping requirements and those that have to funnel into the database. And they're also worried about the burdens that it might impose on operators. So essentially, it's what the NPRM does is it fulfills a mandate of Congress that came in the 2010 FAA Authorization Extension Act, and it required FAA to build an electronic database for air carriers to be able to access pilot records. So in the NPRM, and then there was an aviation rulemaking that was a government industry that looked at it, and FAA looked at those requirements and looked at what Congress asked and put together this NPRM that would require all air carriers, whether it's Part 135 or 121, but also the public charters under 125. And it would also apply to fractional owners. And for the first time, it would apply to, and air tour operators, anyone commercial essentially, but as well as corporate flight departments. And a concern of it is the rulemaking actually puts a definition on corporate flight departments, which wasn't there before. And essentially it defines it as any entity with 2 or more aircraft. And generally you have to have a type rating. Typically you'd have Part 142 training. And FAA's reasoning behind adding the corporate flight departments is because in the congressional language, it said that that the pilot record database requirement should apply to air carriers and, quote, other persons, but they didn't describe what other persons were. So that left FAA to make the definition, and they decided corporate flight departments could serve as a gateway to air carriers. So therefore, they had to comply with it in case their pilots one day, in case air carriers needed to access their records. And, there's some inconsistencies with the reporting requirements for 135 operators. They'd have to provide records back to 2006. For public operators, it would be 2010. The burdens of looking up the records. And the other thing is the scope of the records. NBAA is concerned the way it's interpreted. You may have to record every landing, every maneuver, and provide all that information because it looks for certain kind of operational experience in there. So it'll be interesting how it plays out.
Yeah, and operators have until June 29th to comment, right?
That's right.
So time is very short. We're already at the end of the week of June 26th. So that leaves just a handful of days, and the FAA is not amenable to extending this, right?
Well, that's the way it appears so far. Sometimes you see those last-minute changes, but according to NBAA, FAA has not been open to extending the deadline, and it is a 200-page rule, and it is new for many operators, so it's a concern. Oh, and another requirement is if you are an air carrier, you have to access these records before you hire, but that's not necessarily the case for corporate flight departments.
Okay. Thanks, Kerry. So, Matt, you've been following some accident investigations this week. So what can you tell us about that?
Chad, you're right. There's two interesting accident reports that came out this week. Yesterday, the Pakistan Air Accidents Investigation Bureau released a very detailed preliminary report on the crash of an Airbus A320 operated by Pakistan International Airlines. The accident was May 22nd this year, and it doesn't really conclude why the accident happened, but it's pretty clear from reading this preliminary report that some questionable flying took place. And the reason this is interesting, I mean, all the details are online. You can read our story on the AIN website. But what I think is interesting about it is the reaction by the Pakistan authorities afterwards. Now, in the report, it says that they're looking into the records of the pilots, but news reports after this report was released suggest that they're purging hundreds of pilots who may have either wrong licenses somehow, or where somebody else took the written tests for some of these pilots. I mean, it's really kind of a debacle, I think. And what it brings up to me is here you have a state-owned airline flying the general public. Any airline, but especially a state-owned airline, ought to have the highest interests of safety and protection for its passengers, and there just should be no question that they're doing everything they can to make sure the pilots are extraordinarily well qualified. Reading this report, it sure doesn't look like that.
It reminds me of a situation in Russia a couple of years ago. They had a similar situation with pilot certificates too. So also you were following a NTSB report that was released this week on the Falcon 50 crash in Greenville, South Carolina. So what's that? What'd you find out about that?
This was another interesting accident that happened September 27th, 2018. So it's a little old, but this is actually the final report. And what's a little surprising about this is that here's a Falcon 50 business jet had a major accident on a Part 135 charter flight carrying passengers. Everybody on board, unfortunately, died in the accident.
Actually, the crew died. The passengers actually lived.
You're right, exactly. So it turns out that the flight crew were not qualified to fly the airplane, And the airplane had some significant maintenance problems that rendered it unairworthy. And they were offering this airplane to the public to charter. Now, this report does have the probable cause because it's the final report, and it basically blames the operator for allowing a flight in an airplane with a known unresolved maintenance discrepancy.
And that was the brakes, right?
Yeah, and it also faults the crew for not dealing with the brake situation because there was a method for bypassing the broken anti-skid system to allow some emergency braking. But that's not how you operate an airplane that you offer for charter, is it?
Certainly not. And also the crew wasn't qualified. One of the pilots was a private pilot, which technically can't operate in a commercial environment, right?
Exactly. The right seater was a private pilot with no qualifications to fly a Falcon 50. And the captain was the owner of the charter operation, and he held a type rating with limited to second in command or co-pilot privileges. So the flight crew wasn't even qualified either. And it's really surprising how an operation could hold itself out to the public and nobody notices this kind of, frankly, illegal charter going on.
All right, thanks, Matt. So, Charlie, we heard from two airlines this week about how they're handling the COVID-19 crisis, Lufthansa and Qantas, and they're kind of both just hanging on, but they're both taking different approaches to how they're fixing this, right?
Yeah, that's right, Chad. Let's cheer ourselves up a bit after those accident reports with some grim airline finance news. And on two sides of the world, as you say, major airlines facing serious problems that really threaten their very survival. In both cases, interestingly, the sum of about $10 billion is at the crux of it. So we'll start here in Europe with Lufthansa. And just a couple of hours ago, Lufthansa's shareholders approved quite a contentious plan for there to be German government financial support in the form of some fresh capital raised and a loan. And this amounts to €9 billion, which is just over $10 billion. It's also been approved by the European Union, and we'll get to that point in a moment. But it almost didn't happen because until about 24 hours ago, one of Lufthansa's leading shareholders, a 79-year-old billionaire called Heinz-Hermann Thiele, was opposing it. He was really mad because in return for this financial aid, the German government is getting a 20% stake, and he didn't like the fact that his equity in the company was going to be diluted. But eventually he relented because I think he realized that it was a better option than letting Lufthansa go bust. So this plan, which will go into immediate effect, should save Lufthansa. They've already made some quite deep cuts in terms of their fleet and their staff. What's interesting to me, a couple of things. You know, I've covered the aviation sector for almost 30 years now. I never, ever thought we'd be talking about Lufthansa going bankrupt, even the possibility of it. I mean, if you'd said to me, I don't know, even around the time of 9/11, Lufthansa may go bust someday, I would have said, no, that's in the realm of hell freezing over and pigs flying. It's just not going to happen. Well, guess what? It almost did happen. The other interesting thing is, the European Union had to approve this state aid. Now, until even a few months ago, the notion of European governments giving subsidies effectively to their national airlines was utterly taboo within the European Union. And the COVID situation has just swept that aside to the point where it just isn't even mentioned in polite company anymore. And I have to say, being based here in the UK as I am, and forgive me for getting started on Brexit, I find it profoundly ironic because one of the things that the people who were in favor of Brexit said was, well, if the UK leaves the European Union, suddenly it will be possible for the government to give subsidies to key state industries like airlines. Well, guess what? We left the European Union. British Airways, Virgin, many other UK carriers are now in severe trouble. And guess what? They're not getting any state aid. So go figure. Anyhow, on the other side of the globe, Qantas today unveiled a recovery plan, a 3-year recovery plan. And the amount involved is some savings that it's got to achieve of just over $10 billion. But it's doing that without any state aid. And it's going to do it by cutting 6,000 jobs, not all pilot jobs, I would hasten to add. There's a mix of pilots and ground crew and management and support people. They're also going to be grounding around 100 of their aircraft for at least 12 months. And the reason for that is that they're pretty much cutting all international service for the time being. They're going to be retiring their 6 remaining 747s. They were going to do that anyway, but they're doing it early. And, this is really an existential crisis for Qantas. The CEO, Alan Joyce, is facing up to it, I think, quite bravely. They're going to take their pain now. And, good luck and Godspeed to all airlines, because heaven knows this is as rough an environment as I've ever known.
Are the measures that both are taking, is that going to be enough?
I believe it will be. The reason I say that is certainly with a company like Lufthansa, which is, has a reputation for being really well managed financially. I have to believe that those German bean counters have been over this, and they figure that their $10 billion plus the cuts that they've already made will be enough. But as we heard from IATA earlier this week on Wednesday, the trouble is that a lot of the projections about how the airlines will do are based on some sort of understanding of how they'll be able to claw their way back from COVID. Well, as we're all aware, wherever we are in the world, COVID is a fundamentally loose and unpredictable situation. And the IATA people warned, look, the warnings we're giving you now are based on what we know. To some degree, all bets are off if it gets worse, if there are flare-ups in infection rates. The chief economist there at IATA said, well, I know we said there could be recovery by, say, the end of 2023. It could be 2024 if there's another flare-up. So we can't be totally sure. Again, with Qantas, similar situation. They're taking their pain now. I believe that fundamentally that's a good airline, just like Lufthansa, and I think they will pull through.
And I guess Qantas would have an option of having government aid should they need more, too.
Well, that's not totally a given. They've had a certain amount of short-term aid in terms of help with furloughing staff, I think. We don't really know what the position of the Australian government would be. At the moment, the Australian government is what could be loosely defined as a sort of conservative, pro-free market type government. But having said that, Qantas is about as iconic an Australian company as you'll get. So I find it somewhat hard to believe they would let them go under.
Okay. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.